The size of the drop in well-being to the low point in the late 40s is equivalent in magnitude to the influence of a major life event like unemployment or marital separation. The size of the fall in well-being from youth to midlife is large and likely highly consequential.
Welcome to the Thrivology Lab podcast, where we explore the science, philosophy, and practice of thriving. Our goal is to help you create a happier and healthier life through education, application, and transformation. Your co-hosts on this journey are Phil Dunwoody, that's me.
And Neil Letterbeck, that's me. Phil and I are both on the faculty at Juniata College, where we teach courses to promote human thriving and well-being. Before we get started, Phil, where can folks find us?
We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can leave a comment or question on YouTube, and we'll be sure to respond. Make sure you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And you can send questions or comments to thrivologylab@gmail.com.
So today's topic is well-being across the lifespan. We're going to organize today's talk across really four main topics. We're going to look at sort of a big picture, this sort of U-shaped big picture of well-being across the lifespan. We're going to look at some developmental changes and impacts across some sort of developmental epochs. We're going to look at self-narratives and then relationship and loneliness across the lifespan. And then we're going to sort of summarize, Phil and I, our big takeaways about this research. And what I would say just at the outset of this is, I love so much. We call this Thrivology Lab, and part of the reason we call it a lab is because you and I are both tinkering and thinking about these things as well. And I think and every episode, every time we work on this, there's stuff I come in with, like, I kind of know this, but I learn something new every time. I would say this, I don't think I'd really looked at all of these things through this particular lens before, and so this episode in particular has been a big learning curve for me, just sort of things I've discovered about that.
Yeah, it's for me too. Teaching psychology, I've kind of known about this. We call this U-shaped connection between happiness and over the lifespan, right? Happiness or subjective well-being, it depends on how you measure it, what you want to call it. But in a nutshell, it means that when you're young, when you're adolescent, teenager, young adulthood, your happiness tends to be very high. And then somewhere in those like mid-20s or so, it starts to go down and continues going down until you hit 40s, 50 or so, and then starts to go back up. And I so I've known about that curve, but I haven't myself kind of done a deep dive into what the literature actually says about it. So this is definitely one that's complicated, right? Mm-hmm. And the question is like, well, first, is there this U-shaped curve? Like, does the data actually bear that out? Do we see it across countries? Do we see it across measures? And then are there, what do we know about it? Why, right? If that's a real thing. So, it fits commonly with what we talk about. People talk about a midlife crisis, right? And this kind of low point in basically around where you and I are at. I think we're the good news is we're on the upswing at this point, according to the data. So, being in this age cohort currently that would be in this midlife slump, I think I get it at some level. There's this sense of, when you're young, often everything seems possible, and you don't have maybe all the responsibilities of a full-time job yet, and a mortgage and debt, and if you've had kids, you've got that. Once you hit midlife, I think there's a couple things happening. One is that you might have children, which are economically expensive, very time consuming. I mean, I love my children, right? Don't take this the wrong way if you're listening, Aaron and Eli. But they're resource intensive, right? And that just means energy, right? So they're sources of love and happiness, but also frustration, right?
We came across one study that even showed that specifically well-being drops for couples when they have a kid goes through adolescence, and once the kid leaves, it starts rising back up. Not to dissuade anyone.
What a coincidence! Yeah, and then part of also what happens during that time for many of us is that we might also have aging parents. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of stressors from both generations, younger and older than where you're sitting. It's also, talking to some of my friends, again, in the same age cohort, a point where some of us say, like, okay, like I went to school or got a job doing whatever, I've got a house, like I've done all the things. And then you're at this point and you're thinking, is this it? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, okay, I think I'm okay with that, but it's a shift in perspective. I think it's, in this recognizing of your mortality to some extent. You start to get more injuries. So there does seem to be this dip in midlife. So David Blanchflower has done a lot of research on this topic. The article I'm going to quote from here is from the Journal of Population Economics, published in 2021. So this is pretty recent. And the title is Happiness U-Shaped Everywhere? Age and Subjective Well-Being in 145 Countries. This is a huge analysis.
Great,
yeah. So I'll read a quote here from the abstract. This paper re-examines the relationship between various measures of well-being and age in 145 countries, including 109 developing countries, controlling for education and marital and labor force status, among others, on samples of individuals under the age of 70. The U-shape of the curve is forcefully confirmed, with an age minimum, or nadir, in midlife, around age 50, welcome to the club, in separate analyses for developing and advanced countries, as well as for the continent of Africa. The happiness curve seems to be everywhere. This is, that's impressive data, right? So it's when we find something that exists across different countries, despite their levels of kind of economic development, despite differences in culture, you start to think that maybe there's something fundamentally biological to it, or maybe there's something just that is similar in terms of our life experiences across those countries. So again, maybe childbearing ages, kind of coming through that. So. And they say they use different measures of well-being. It's because they're analyzing lots of different data here. And so different countries and different researchers have used different measures of happiness and well-being. And so they're saying, well, across all of those, across all these different countries, we see it over and over again. Mm-hmm. And in Europeans on both sides of the Atlantic, it shows up with that kind of, again, middle-age dip. And it seems, they say peak unhappiness is somewhere between this 43 and 48 years of age. And, that's an average, right? So it's going to swing.
And I think all that, I think things like this are also important to put like an asterisk on all of that. It's like, when we zoom out, we can start seeing these trends, and those are important, I think, to your point, like what might be contributing to some of those trends. But as soon as we start zooming in, that's when I think it starts to get complicated with some nuance about and then you get really zoomed in to an N of 1. And like, if somebody's listening, it's like, that doesn't sound like my life at all. Well, we might also look at some of the factors that might contribute to some of that, that maybe disappear or get obscured when you start zooming out to those larger numbers.
Yeah, these are averages. It's a really good point, because this is something that comes up a lot where, I can say that on average men are taller than women.
Right.
That does not mean that every male is taller than every woman. It's obviously false, right? But on average, it's true. And so this is, the way kind of statistics and social science works, and even biological. So it's on average. And when you take a medication, a prescription, you don't know that it's going to help you. Your doctor doesn't either. Right. They know that on average, it helps people like you.
Right.
Right. And so you have this is just because biological life is complicated in a nutshell. This brings us to the intro quote, right? I'm just going to read that again. The size of the drop in well-being to the low point in the late 40s is equivalent in magnitude to the influence of a major life event like unemployment or marital separation. The size of the fall in well-being from youth to midlife is large and likely highly consequential. Like that's a big, to say that's the equivalent of losing your job, which for some people may not. That's one of the major life disruptions. We see large decreases in happiness when people lose their job, or a marital separation. Again, these are big life changes.
Or one of the other things I was thinking about the other day, like as medicine technology advances and people start living longer, we often deal with death later. So what might have been like the loss of a parent earlier in one's life, and you have to sort of deal with that sense of mortality earlier, now that's extending for many of us until much later. And so like for myself, I didn't really have I didn't have to deal with that until I was in my 40s, and so like I didn't have a sense of reference point for that. And so I think that's an important thing to point for myself to point to as well.
Yeah, it's impressive just how universal this midlife drop seems to be, just how consistent it is. And that's not to say that it's a good thing. I think most of us don't want to be experiencing that. But yeah, it seems to be there. It's in the data. Now, something to point out is that almost all of this data is what we call cross-sectional. And that's in compared to what we would call longitudinal data. And so just to unpack that briefly, cross-sectional is if you went out today and you asked people, what's your age and how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And so you could collect, you could collect data all over the world in, let's say, a couple week period. And you've got people who are very young, you've got people midlife, you've got people who are very old, and you plot this curve and you see it. That is not longitudinal data collection. Would be we find people when they're very young and we ask them these questions, and then we follow those same exact people over time, over their lifespan. And so 10 years later, we call them up and say, hey, how happy are you on the same scale? And then 10 years later, and so we do that until essentially they're old and dead. Now, we use both of those forms of data collection in social science all the time. Longitudinal data is very hard to get, obviously, because if you're talking the lifespan, it might take you 70 plus years to collect data. That's a long data collection project. There are people who do that. There are labs who do that. The data with Blanchflower is cross-sectional. Cheng et al. In a 2017 study looks at longitudinal evidence for the same midlife dip. And I'm going to read here from the article. Right, there is a large amount of cross-sectional evidence for a midlife low in the life cycle of human happiness and well-being, a U-shape. Yet no genuinely longitudinal inquiry has uncovered evidence for a U-shaped pattern. Thus, some researchers believe the U is a statistical artifact. We're going to come back to that point. We re-examine this fundamental cross-disciplinary question. We suggest new tests drawing on 4 data sets and only with in-person changes in well-being, meaning this is longitudinal data. We document powerful support for a U shape in unadjusted longitudinal data. So they're saying even when we do this kind of longitudinal data, which is much harder to get, we still see this U shape.
And I think some of that, to me, seems counterintuitive when you think about like that you going back up in older age, because I think what I would have typically thought was that as people get older, you have far more health concerns, you have financial concerns, that it would seem that it would be harder to maintain that well-being. And in 2 large national cohort studies, this is a 2010 paper that pulled data from the German Socioeconomic Panel Study and the British Household Panel Study, massive national studies that began in 1984 and 1991, respectively. And a couple of things that they found was part of the reason that might and I think you sort of pointed to this earlier on, was that as you get older, you also begin to recognize the scarcity of things. Like your years are running out. I want to start enjoying those more. And something else, and this will sort of spoiler alert, is one of my major takeaways, is that the more physical and mental health a person has earlier in life and is able to sustain that, the more predictive of happiness and well-being they're in their later years. So that health becomes its own kind of buffer against some of the negative impacts that one might face in aging.
So it's not just a now; it's an investment in your
Right.
future well-being.
Right. I think we often, and we even sort of have talked about it being sort of a benefit, exercise, say, or a good diet or sleep or all these things for the here and now improves my day-to-day. But maintaining a kind of habit, a lifestyle of those actually is preventative.
That's
And
right. Resilience.
Resilience.
Right.
Resilience.
We've talked a lot about this in that the point of the class you and I teach, and even this podcast. It's not. I mean, yes, it is about feeling better now,
Right.
but a lot of it is also about building resilience, because bad things just happen in life. You go through difficult times, and if you've got strategies, if you've got good habits, it's going to be easier to get through those. Right. One of the things I just want to mention that popped into my head as you were talking, you and I have talked a lot about savoring.
Right. Yes.
Right. This is part of basic mindfulness practice, is noticing what's around you and appreciating it, and not this not this false sense of like, oh, everything is wonderful and I'm just going to be what they call toxic positivity.
Right.
But rather this genuine sense of enjoying. If I'm drinking a cup of coffee, enjoy the cup of coffee. If the birds are singing, notice them. That this is, and this also includes actually bad things in your life and mindfulness. They would say also that you should notice how you are feeling, notice kind of your emotions, what your body's telling me, what's happening in your environment, whether they are good or bad.
The Stoics would say amor fati, like love your fate, like whatever it is, love it. And I think you brought up perspective, and I don't want to jump ahead, but we're going to talk about sort of the importance of that mindset as we get older. But can you talk, Phil, a little bit about you mentioned this sort of statistical artifact, and like what does that mean, and why might there be some of this debate around that curve?
Yeah. Okay. So this gets a little complicated, and we're not gonna do a deep dive on this, because this is the often when people ask scientists questions, they get this, well, it depends as an answer, and it's the kind of answer that I honestly, it's like scientists often like, because it means there's nuance and it's complicated and we get to like nerd out on it. But if you just want a simple answer, it's a little bit more confusing. So there is debate, and there has been pushback as to whether or not this U-shaped curve is real. Right. So what do I mean by that? Because I said 145 countries, it's everywhere. Yes, but all of that data is analyzed a specific way. And the size of the dip in middle age does seem to depend a good bit on how you actually analyze the data. So when scientists measure the relationship between two variables, they often try and control for other things that they're not really interested in, but might impact their data. And I think a really good example is like if we look at the relationship between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer. Like obviously those two things are correlated. At this point, we know they're causal. Smoking causes lung cancer, but at some point we weren't sure, right? And if we were analyzing the correlation, we might say, well, what if we control statistically for poverty, because you might be more likely to smoke if you live in poverty, and we know that people who live in poverty are actually exposed to a whole range of toxins in their environment. So there are other things that might be cancer causing that essentially co-vary with smoking. And so at least conceivably, it's not the smoking that causes the lung cancer, it's other things that are confounded with smoking. And so this is where we statistically control for these third variables. And
And just
Blanchflower,
for people listening, what does that mean to control for that? Like, what do you?
it means
what do
to essentially remove the impact of it. So you'd say, so we see the correlation between smoking and lung cancer, and it doesn't matter what else I control for statistically, which means I'm pulling it out of the data in a way. The fact that the correlation is still there means that we think it's real. If you control for things and the correlation goes away, then you say, okay, what does that mean? Right? Because then maybe it's not actually causal in the way that you thought it was. Now, this, like I said, this gets complicated, and I'll just give you a quick example. I had someone say to me at one point that, well, I'm not sure that seasonal affective disorder is real, because if you control for going outside, it disappears. Seasonal affective disorder is essentially you get depressed in the wintertime. And it's okay, well, let's think about this, right? So why, part of well-being and happiness and then the inverse, depression, is time outside. We've covered data on this, and time in the sun, and which helps regulate your circadian rhythm. And in the winter, people don't go outside as much. And I'm going to point to you. You're
Yes,
a great example of this because you
absolutely.
don't like the cold.
No, not at all.
Right? I'll just put on another layer. I'm good.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm out there regardless. But so as I'm saying, well, once you control for time outside, the relationship between seasons and depression goes away. And some people might conclude, therefore, seasonal affective disorder is not real. Now you're smiling, right? Like but you're not going outside because it's cold,
Right.
So does it really make sense to control for the
Right,
amount you're
right.
going outside? This is where the type of data analysis you do. We might instead of controlling for it, do what we call a mediation test, where we say, well, geez, the reason that season is related to depression is because you're not going outside. And so we control it, we model for it in a different way. And because some people do go outside in the winter and others don't. I mean, you don't. My wife is one who doesn't like the cold.
Yeah.
So there is good reason to debate what you should and shouldn't control for, and researchers don't always agree. And this is where you can have debate on how is the U-shaped pattern real. Blanchflower in the 145 country data we talked about, it controlled for variables like sex, marital status, education, labor force status. Cheng in the longitudinal data looked at uncontrolled data. In other words, they did not control for third variables, and still found a U. Bartram published a critique of Blanchflower's paper, essentially saying you control for too many things and you only include people under 70. If we don't control for those variables, we see that the U-shaped dip, like, it's still there, but it is much, much, much smaller. You and I are looking at the graph, which you can't see on the podcast, but yeah, it's still there, but it's small.
Right.
And so it kind of like, it doesn't seem like nearly the big deal as Blanchflower talks about it in terms of these major life events. So, what do we conclude from this? Well, I think we can say, okay, well, it is real. There is this midlife dip. But how big it is really depends on how you analyze the data. And if you really want to geek out on that, you have to go read a whole bunch of articles and take some statistics classes.
Well, I think to your point, like why it might be there, what are some of the life factors that are happening in that dip that have changed? And like we're going to talk about sort of emerging adulthood, which is a population, you and I work with a great deal, and how even in our time teaching, how that population has changed.
Oh my gosh!
Because of technology, the economic situation. It used to be that going to college was a boon. Like you go and had 4 years of just sort of Animal House. You went and partied and just you were almost guaranteed employment after it. And now those outcomes are less, or feel to some students less certain. So a lot of students are coming to us at 18 already carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders for a whole host of reasons. But
it's so true. We have seen, I've been teaching here at Juniata for 21 years now, and my job has changed a lot in that when I started, I had to be a subject matter expert, and of course I advise students on, signing up for classes in their future, but I wasn't dealing with the students I was working with. We're not dealing with the kind of mental health challenges that the students today are. And we see this in the national data. This is by no means unique to us, in that we see really pretty epidemic levels of anxiety and depression in today's kind of emerging adults. And this has shown up in the data, right? And so this U-shaped curve, we have seen this in the data starting in the 1970s when people started looking at this data, but it has started to change. The last 5 years or so, younger adults show a significant drop in happiness compared to earlier data, and a significant increase in despair, which is, really, really negative. So, if you look at the data from 2022 forward, rather than this U-shape, it looks like you're starting really unhappy and then getting happier over time, which is a very different thing. And then if you look at feelings of despair, you see this big change in the data before 2022 and after 2022. And Blanchflower, who did this analysis as well, is basically saying you need to, what changed? What changed in our environment sometime in the 2010s? And he points to smartphones. And you and I talked about smartphone use a good bit. The CDC data shows that 1 in 4 teenagers spend more than 4 hours a day on their phone. And it may be that the phone itself is bad, right? And that some of the social media apps, but it may also be, and this is what we talked about, it's not just time on the phone, it's what you're not doing because you're on the phone, right? You're not spending time with your family. You're not spending time with your friends in real life. You're not outside. You're not exercising. And so it's probably some combination of kind of the shallowness of looking for affirmation through likes, and then what gets taken out of your life because you're on your phone so much. So this is a big change.
And I think that's such an important point to highlight, that people would often say, well, a cell phone is just a tool. The internet's just a tool. And that's true, but I think your point that it's not so much that the tool may be the problem, but to your point, it's all the stuff that's not happening that would have otherwise happened to help a developing young person, develop social skills and understand relationships and community and all these, and time and nature and all those other things that might have been naturally part of our childhood, say.
Yeah, and of course, and these social media apps are essentially monetizing your eyeballs, right? So the longer you look at the app, the more money they make, because it's all advertising is how they make their money. And so they've got mass amounts of data to help make their platforms as addictive as possible. And that's in their best interest. It's not in the public's best interest. And so, there's, this is, it's a hell of an experiment we're running, I think, to the detriment of young adults.
And, talking about this sort of young adulthood, this emerging adulthood, and what I find fascinating when we look at like these developmental epochs, that they're largely culturally, technologically, economically driven. We think about like the emergence of the teenager in the 1950s, and flashing all the way back to sort of Elizabethan England, there was childhood and there was adulthood. And as soon as you were old enough to work, off you went, 13-year-old, which is why like Romeo and Juliet to an Elizabethan, sure, a 13-year-old's going to fall in love. That's what you do. And but to us, we identify these new sort of developmental epochs. And one of them that has come up in, say, the past 10 years or so is this sort of emerging adulthood, which is largely between the ages of 18 and 29, which, is as we already sort of mentioned, is now much more fraught with all kinds of, partially driven by sort of social media, but like relationships, jobs, financial concerns. What does the average 18-year-old now have to think about? And you and I often tout the benefits of higher education is not just career readiness. It's also, how do you live a good life? What is well-being? What is your values and your purpose? Also, like, how do you be a good citizen in the world? But by and large, most of the young people coming in are principally focused on, will this curriculum get me a job? And, that's what their parents, their high school counselors. And, one of the things that we often see is that seeds of later mental health disorders, there's a statistic, this comes out of a 2024 paper, 75% of mental disorders in adulthood have the first episode around the age of 25. So you're seeing these sort of seeds being planted that sort of blossom later in life as well. And that's probably not a surprise to anybody. But the authors of this paper, Ariadna Martinez Garcia et al., the paper is Promoting Mental Health in Higher Education. One of the things that they're advocating, and of course we're biased to this, is including more well-being in the curriculum for this emerging adult, so they can think about. One of the things we constantly hear in our class is like students saying, I've never been asked to think about these things, my values, my purpose, like all these things, and these are, for many of them, students about ready to graduate. So, and this, I think you and I would probably argue, this is exactly the time to start thinking about those things. What are my values?
I mean, it's an incredible statement, right? At the time where you're choosing what might be a career path, you're saying, no one has actually asked me to think about what my values and goals are and what I want out of life. Right. It's just assumed that you'll figure it out, and what society tells you, well, you need money, and maybe it's that simple.
And like I would, I think we'd be the first to say, like, that's also a very privileged place to be able to think about what you want to do with your life. That comes with a great deal of privilege, but that we have that opportunity, we should be using it to its fullest to, I think, improve the quality of the collective well-being as well. And something that the authors of that paper point to, and they reference Corey Keyes, who's a sociologist we've talked about a fair bit on this podcast. He wrote a fantastic book called Languishing. And this was a sort of a discovery for me of late as well, and thanks in large part to you, my friend. And we include sort of leisure and play in our model, and I might not have had included that before. And one of the things Corey Keyes talks about is having that this flourishing across the lifespan is both eudaimonic and hedonic perspective. The eudaimonic is sort of your purpose and your values and purpose, and usually has an outward facing, like, what is my purpose to a community, to people? This also obviously comes from Aristotle's work. He claimed that eudaimonic was the highest form of well-being, and hedonic is the pleasure side. How do I feel? Do I feel good stuff? And I think having both is important. What they're saying, and what we're going to see, especially as we get to later life, having a strong sense of both is really critical. If that emerging adulthood is sort of, maybe we could argue, is like the beginning of that downhill into the dip, and we get to this midlife, what are some of the things that sort of we see showing up in that low point?
Yeah, this term midlife crisis, we think was first coined by Elliot Jacques, a Canadian psychoanalyst, in 1965, and it referred to a developing phenomenon in the 20th century where people began fearing their own mortality and pursuing unrealized life goals. And again, you and I we talked about this earlier in this episode, that this point of, like, is this it? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good question to ask at any point, right? You should be kind of reevaluating. So crisis frames it as a negative way. And of course, if we're gonna co-opt good business speak, Every crisis is really just an opportunity.
Right.
Right. So we could say it's a midlife opportunity. Right. But I like that frame, honestly, because you should be saying, okay, well, this is what I've done so far. Do I want to just continue to be a creature of momentum? Because this is the path I'm on. Or do I want to stop and ask myself, is this really the path I want to be on? Which I think is that can lead to perhaps some existential crisis, but perhaps also some greater sense of agency and well-being. So we've talked about the stressors of midlife in terms of, possibly childcare as well as elder care and aging adults. But there are also opportunities in that you might be doing well in your career. Of course, you might not, but hopefully you are. You might experience greater kind of emotional self-control. Hopefully, you've matured, you've learned some things. People of color, LGBTQ, and women suffer the most, as do those in lower income brackets, especially when healthcare is limited, right? So this is certainly, like, at any point in life, health issues are going to significantly impact your well-being, but that is going to disproportionately hit people kind of depending on where they are in the society.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I really hear in what you just said is this idea of perspective, and that becomes so even more so as we get older. The perspective with which we drawing on sort of mindfulness, surprise, surprise, we're coming back to mindfulness, like this idea of letting go of expectations. I expect things to go a particular way, and I hold on to that. I want that to be permanent, and so I get frustrated when it's not. And, I think when we often are, certainly our parents, grew up in a place where you had a particular life course, you got a job, you stayed in that job for your entire career, you retired, and this is what retirement looks like, and you got married, you had a house, you had all these like cultural expectations of what you were supposed to do in life. And now I think for us, and certainly for the emerging adult demographic, like those are shifting. Like, and what we often talked about, Sue, is like supposed to is a very limiting mindset. Like when you get trapped in like, I'm supposed to do this, then that, I think one of the things I see popping out in this midlife crisis is when what you're supposed to no longer fits what you feel inside you really were meant to do, or like your heart wants to do, and those conflicts.
This is we talked about Martha Beck's book, kind of Living with Integrity, and that's the term she uses, integrity. We've internalized all these societal narratives about what we're supposed to do to be happy, to be successful, and they may or may not be a good fit. And it's this is kind of like one of them, I think, is this idea that you're always supposed to be advancing, you're always supposed to be moving up, right? The hierarchy in some way. But that's, there are a lot of assumptions built into that you might say, actually, I'm pretty happy where I am, and moving up seems to, it might look like it's actually just more work and more stress. And I know that time is limited, and maybe I want to spend more time fishing. Right. And I don't fish, but people do, right? But I think those questions about, kind of questioning the narrative we've internalized, the story, is really important. Yeah,
and that I think is so important. That the idea of story and the stories we tell ourselves. And you and I were recent couple, I don't know how long it's been, 2 years ago. We were in Costa Rica surfing, and we met this woman in her 50s, or maybe she was even in her 60s, and had quit her job to become a travel agent, and she was now blissfully happy, which you would otherwise say, like, that must be really scary to shift careers in such an argumentatively later period in life. But she did, and now couldn't be happier as a result. And like, some of that is based in that storytelling And some of those stories, and grab your cocoa because I'll tell a story here as well. Some of those, and this is where I think one of my big takeaways from all of this has popped up. And like, we plant these seeds, particularly early on in our life, often early in our life, and those grow. And if we're here, I'll continue my garden metaphor. If we're not tending that garden mindfully, they can grow into different weeds. So the story that I was telling you that's come up for me recently in a retreat I was just at, we'll talk more about that at some later podcasts, I'm sure. But when I must have been like 12 years old, and I was on a summer swim team in like northern farm town, Indiana, and it was just like preteen kids learning to swim, and we have these quote unquote competitions with other local swim groups. And the coaches, and this is an important part, were probably themselves, maybe they were high school students, maybe they were college students. They were kids themselves, were the coaches. And one of the coaches put me into backstroke, which was not a stroke I used. I was very good at, and here's this Saturday competition, and I somehow managed to swim into the other guy's lane. I think I got like tangled up into the ropes, and by the time I got out of the pool, my team was laughing, the other team was laughing, our coaches were laughing. And if I zoom out, if I take it objectively, that's a funny thing. If I saw it on YouTube,
how old were you?
Probably 12.
Yeah, but 12-year-olds, like, you don't like that at that point. You're pretty socially hypersensitive.
Right. I think it's just at that beginning where I was just beginning to be aware that I had opinions about other people and people had presumably opinions about me. Mm-hmm. And you know, the event itself was funny, and I wouldn't now blame them for laughing. But I told myself this story that I was a screw up. I didn't belong. I had no business being there. I wasn't an athlete. And then I went in the next day. I told my mom, I was like, I'm going to quit. And she's like, okay, but you have to do it, great, good parenting. She made me sort of take responsibility for that. I went in and told this quote unquote coach I was going to quit. And he was like, yeah, okay, cool. And so, which of course, like, he doesn't have time to worry.
Lots of support and encouragement.
Right. So what I, again, immediately told myself, not only do I not belong, but nobody wants me there anyway.
Yeah.
And so, and I see that narrative, if I track that narrative, it has evolved into all kinds of behaviors. Things like I don't typically speak up in meetings because, and it took me, I probably told this on here before, like it took me 10 years, 3 schools in 2 states to finally get through my undergraduate. And during that time, I also joined the military. I did an internship with Disney, and all the while bouncing around, partly because I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere. I didn't belong. Like, this wasn't the right fit. And like, I track all of this across my life. Like, oh, I can sort of track that seed to that moment.
Yeah, that's a long, and you're in your 50s now, and this is
in
something,
it's
still a very vivid memory for you, which shows the emotional impact at that time and how it's stuck with you.
But I don't think I realized, I've always had that visceral memory, but I don't think I understood for myself how those kinds of developmental memories stick with us in ways that inform our behavior. Like, I think I've accomplished a lot in my life. I'm very proud of my accomplishment. And yet here's that nugget that still persists.
Yeah.
And we see that talking, so that's a very long story to get to. Like, part of what we see in particularly older people is, to your point, is like their perspective. How do you view this? Is this like, well, it's the end, screw it, I'm done? Or do you feel like I'm going to savor all these moments? Even though what we also see is like loneliness is a major factor for people, but I'm also curating some of my friendships. I have deeper friendships now. I have more people I trust. And so how do we tell those more positive stories?
That's a risk factor throughout life, but we see in older adults, especially loneliness. But at any point in life, loneliness is just really bad for your health. You know, we are social beings. It helps with our emotional regulation, to feel connected, to feel loved, to feel wanted, to belong. And the more you feel lonely, which this, if you're, again, if you're an older adult and you lose your spouse, right, that can be a huge loss. And you see instances where people lose their spouse and then they seem to go downhill pretty quickly and die not long afterwards. There was, in looking at this kind of happiness in older adults, we did find some interesting research on kind of the impact of essentially economics, of financial well-being, in that when you are young, it doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. In other words, whether I make a lot or a little, it doesn't really have much of an impact on my happiness and well-being. As you age, the impact of your finances has a larger and larger impact. And I thought this was interesting, right? This is one of those things. Well, if I had known that when I was 20, maybe I would have saved more.
Right.
No one told me that, because that's one of the because saving, putting money aside at 20 is, according to this research, not going to have much of an impact on my well-being then, but it will have a huge impact on my well-being later. So, I mean, it's very long-term thinking, obviously, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, at one point in our notes, we had much more pieces on this sort of financial well-being perspective. So much, and I think for both of us, it became so important that we shuttled that out, and we're going to do a whole podcast on that, because I think that's absolutely right. Like, I think for me, I'll speak for myself as well, like, I didn't have a lot of sort of financial education as a young person from my family. And so I've had to sort of cobble this together in relatively late in life to start thinking about some of these things. And particularly looking at this evidence, how important that is for well-being in older age is really important. Yeah.
One of the things that shifts also at old age, people seem to have fewer relationships, but they're deeper relationships. And it really is the quality that matters there more than the quantity. You can have a lot of relationships and still feel lonely. You can have a small number of very meaningful relationships and not feel lonely, and that is more important. So, and it does seem that as people age, it's like they're pruning. They're okay. My time is limited. This person's an ass. I don't want to spend time with them. Right? They're more selective.
Right.
And I think that's interesting.
And probably like those, what's the great Oscar Wilde quote? Youth is wasted on the young. Like, like if I had known that when I was 20, I probably would have been more selective in my 20s. But part of that learning curve is figuring that out as well.
Sure. Yep.
And so part of that, and this leads into the stories we tell and the observation, leads to something we've sort of been dancing around a bit about, and that's journaling. And so our
which you're a big fan of. You do a lot of journaling.
Huge fan of journaling.
Full disclosure, I have tried. Yeah. I occasionally decide I'm going to be journaling, and I get a week or so, and then a month later, I'm like, wait a minute, I was journaling, wasn't I?
Well, something I've also noticed, and we'll talk about this comes a lot from the work of James Pennebaker, who's a social psychologist, a professor emeritus at University of Texas, Austin. And he has a fantastic book called Expressive Writing. He has several really great books, but the book I know is Expressive Writing. And what he has shown is, and his model, and we'll talk about sort of the sequence of events, is he would have people. Particularly, he was looking at sort of traumatic events or like major emotional events, is like write about that. And he would have them write for it's like 30 minutes, 4 times over 4 weeks. And so you wrote about the same thing repeatedly. And what he would sort of notice, and I've noticed this myself in sort of following this, is the first time you're writing about something, it's very emotionally charged. Even the language is all very emotional. You feel, even writing about it, very emotional. And as you go through, it's almost as if it's sort of not desensitized, but you've reconciled some of that such that it becomes more objective by the time you get to the later writings. It's like, this happened. There it is. Like, I don't feel so emotionally charged by the thing anymore. And I think that, to your point, if people are not a journaler, like I've been trying lately to journal through like an app on my phone, because I thought, well, I'll have it wherever I go. So if I have some thought, I can journal in there. But maybe it's just because I'm old-fashioned. I journal much more if I've got pen and paper. Mm-hmm. So the mode in which you do it may be particular to. I don't know of any evidence that says one is better than the other. I think to the point, like if you enjoy doing it, you're probably more likely to stick with it.
So let me ask the big picture question here, because we're going to go into the process. You're going to talk about. Why does this matter, right? Why would I want to, and how's it related to happiness and well-being? You to some extent just answered that, but make it obvious for us.
Well, I think I think it goes for this whole thing. Something about the stories we tell ourselves, and recognizing what is the event or the circumstance I'm in, and how much of it is a story I'm telling myself about it. And sometimes putting things in writing, it concretizes it in a way that you can then see it. It's not just sort of floating in the ether of my mind, but I can see like, oh, do I really think that about this? I put that into writing. Do I believe that actually? What I think it was, you brought up Martha Beck, like what's her, like, is this true? What is her phrase? She has that fantastic. Is it true?
Remember it off the top of my head. Am I sure it's really true? That's right. Because we have these stories we tell ourselves. It's coming back to me. I don't remember the exact words, but
I think it's so. And I think for me, like a lot of things can just sort of sit in my head or in my heart. I'm feeling a thing, but when you put it into paper, it gives it this sort of objective artifact that you can then reflect on, which is the last part of his Pennebaker's process. Is like, so he's got this 4-stage. You choose a topic, an event, or a question you have about, what are my values, what are anything. We're at any stage in your life, and write freely. And this is a really important part, that you don't edit during this. You just write. Even if it's like, I don't know what to say, you just write. And one of the rules I give myself, and this is both as a journal, when I'm journaling or writing creatively, writing plays, I give myself some time domain. He talks about 30 minutes. If that feels like it's too long for you, start with 5, 10, and just write. And you just can't you can't take the pen off the paper. It just has to move. And even if it's like, I don't know what to say, this is dumb, I don't know why I'm even doing this, just make the pen go. And eventually it's almost like the pen just takes a life of itself, and you start writing. And what he would also encourage you is try to write emotionally. Talk about how you feel. How does an event feel? Use emotional language, he would say. And then reflect on it. Look at what you did, and notice that to our point from Martha Beck, like, is that true? Like, I felt this. Is it true? Or, is it fleeting? Or, like, is it part of a narrative I've formed for myself?
Okay, so I think that's our challenge this week, right, is essentially a journal. So I'm going to find my journal first, because I do have one. And I started somewhere around, I don't know when I started. It might have been around New Year's or so. All right, I'm going to do this. So that's it for this episode. Subscribe to the Thrivology Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment or question on YouTube, and we'll be sure to respond. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you have questions or comments, or there's a subject you'd like to hear us discuss, please reach out to thrivologylab@gmail.com. Thrive on.
Thrive on, friends.